It's time for... Okay. Welcome everyone to the Accounting Design Project. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Ayung and Stephen for setting up this wonderful series. It's a great opportunity for us to look at papers that are focusing on some fundamentals issues, very interesting. So let me introduce our speaker today. Presenting for us today is Martin Kapons. He is a candidate this year on the market from the Tilburg School, and he has been a CARE Scholar at the University of Notre Dame for the past year. So he is going to talk to us today about R&D expenses, R&D capitalization, book to price ratio, and cross-section of returns, continuing in week 2 of our R&D theme. So let me give you a couple of ground rules for today. So first of all, please mute yourself and share your video if you are comfortable. That gives a little bit more of a reminiscent of an actual seminar. We will give Martin the first 5 minutes and the last 5 minutes of the presentation uninterrupted. After the first 5 minutes, if you would like to ask a question, please type in the chat to me that you have a question. Just the word question will suffice, and I will interrupt Martin and I will invite you to ask your question. Please unmute yourself and share your video if you are comfortable, and then go ahead and introduce yourself, your name and your school, and ask a question. And I believe that is it. So Martin, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Alina. And also thank you very much, Ayung and Stephen, for giving me the opportunity to present this paper. This paper is about R&D expenses, R&D capitalization, and how those variables relate to the book to price ratio and the cross-section of future realized returns. And it is maybe important to relate that to Paul's talk, in that Paul last week talked about the UK setting and how R&D capitalization reacts to future returns around the IFRS adoption. Here in this paper, I talk about the US setting. So under current US GAAP, R&D activities are required to be capitalized, expensed, and therefore this is a distinctive feature. So here we're talking about the US setting. Now, how did I motivate this paper, or how did this paper come about? This is basically motivated by 2 observations in the literature. First, capitalized R&D to prices associated with future realized returns. And the motivation to actually construct a capitalized R&D asset is based on a finding that past R&D expenditures are associated with current earnings. So for example, Leff and Sugianis, 1996, found that R&D expenditures of the past 8 years are associated with current earnings. And based on that and estimated useful lives for specific R&D intensive industries, they constructed a capitalized R&D asset, which they also found is associated with future realized returns. Now, this is focused, of course, on firms that have R&D expenditures. Now, in a recent working paper, Leff and Srivastava found that an adjusted, or a book-to-price ratio, which is adjusted for the capitalization of intangibles, actually improves the returns to the book-to-price ratio. And their motivation was that given that intangibles are expensed, they are missing from equity book value, and which then implies that it actually distorts equity book value, according to the argument, and therefore adjusting equity book value by capitalizing intangibles improves the returns to the book to price ratio. Now, the second finding of the literature is that expensed R&D to price is also associated with future realized returns. And that is actually appealing, because you would not have to construct a capitalized R&D asset so as to account for R&D active firms and their returns, but could rather use the income statement number current R&D expenditures to account for such firms. And you could also argue that expense R&D to price is actually a timelier measure than capitalized R&D, as capitalized R&D aggregates historical R&D expenditure information. And to also speak to the point that Lev and Srivastava made, you could actually argue that R&D to price and capitalized R&D to price may actually explain variation in future returns that are orthogonal to that of the book to price ratio. What do I mean by that? Given price, a firm that heavily invests in R&D activities might have a lower equity book value than a similar firm that invests a similar amount in tangible assets. And therefore, given that R&D active firms have a lower book to price ratio, but could earn higher returns in the future when these R&D activities pay off, this subset of firms, the R&D active firms, may serve as a hedge to the positive association between the book to price ratio and subsequently realized returns. Now, so we have these two findings. R&D capitalization is associated with future realized returns, and expense R&D is also associated with future realized returns. But very little is known which of the two are actually more informative about future returns. And therefore, I asked the question, is capitalized R&D more informative about future realized returns than R&D expenses? And I will structure the analysis in two parts. First, for all firms, those with and without R&D expenditures, to answer the question whether a R&D capitalization adjusted book to price ratio is more informative about future realized returns than R&D to price and book to price as separate variables. And then in the second part, I would, for the subset of firms that have R&D expenditures, also examine whether there is any incremental information in capitalized R&D to price over and above expensed R&D to price. And the findings, to already show these here in the beginning, is that an R&D capitalization adjusted book to price ratio improves the returns to the book to price ratio, as has been found by Lev and Srivastava. But actually, if you put R&D to price and an unadjusted book to price ratio as separate variables in a Fama-MacBeth regression, you get a better association with future realized returns than having the R&D capitalization adjusted book to price ratio alone in this Fama-MacBeth regression. And this implies that actually the subset of firms that have R&D expenditures serve as a hedge to the book to price ratio. As for the firms that have actually R&D expenditures, the capitalized R&D to price ratio and the expense R&D to price ratio are equally informative about future realized returns. And to really tease out some incremental information content, comparing these two ratios is a bit challenging because they're extremely correlated. The Spearman rank correlation is more I think it is 0.9. And therefore, I rely on sample splits so as to tease out any incremental information. So one might argue that actually this result is driven by firms that have a short history of R&D expenditures, for which the capitalized R&D asset might be negligible. But I show that actually the result also holds for firms that have a long history of R&D expenditures. And one might actually argue that the result might be driven by holding the useful life constant throughout the sample. But when I account for time varying useful lives within R&D intensive industries, both ratios are still equally informative about future realized returns. And then finally, I also do an analysis on an extreme subsample where there's no correlation whatsoever between these two ratios, namely when current R&D expenditures are zero, but firms still have positive capitalized R&D asset, Here I find that capitalized R&D is not associated with future realized returns, which might imply that it is actually current R&D expenditures that drive the returns of these two variables and future realized returns.
Martin,
Lastly,
Martin, is that okay? We have our first question.
Oh, yes, please.
From Sudipta.
Great. Hi, Sudipta.
A couple of questions about the data. So one is about firms that have patents or receive patents but don't report any R&D. So there's a paper called Missing R&D in the JE in 2015 by Ko and Reeb. And they show that there are a lot of these pseudo-blank firms. So I guess from a data perspective, you would just argue that this bias is against your finding or something, but it seems like there may be reasons that they're not disclosing such as proprietary costs, and there may be a group of firms for which the returns are even bigger than the ones you're observing.
Yes, that is a great point. I will talk about the data in a bit, but it is is there a way to tease out these firms or to identify these firms in a reliable way? Then I would be very much looking forward to look into this.
So they look at sort of, US Patent Office filings, European Patent Office filings, and so on to identify firms for which we know for sure they're doing R&D.
Okay, but is this in the European setting or in the
US?
US?
This is the US setting. This is US.
Okay.
It's 2015, Ko and Reeb,
Yes.
so it's easy to find.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I will look into this.
And then the second question I brought up last time to Paul as well was about acquired R&D. So R&D acquired in mergers, acquisitions, and how you would think about that in this capitalization versus expensing context.
Yes,
because you're mandated to capitalize them, except for IP R&D, but there's sort of industries where there's variation. And so how would you think about that kind of R&D?
Of course,
as opposed
that's
to
a great point.
organic?
And this is of course also one of the topics that is some debate on how to actually lay out acquired R&D versus expensed R&D. I actually do not account for these cases here, but this is something that I still have to look into whether or how I could account for this sample. But I think again, given that there's that I have much variation for the expensed R&D here, I think this is already a nice subsample to look at for my analysis. Thanks.
I think, Martin, there's one more question from Peter raised his hand, Peter Pope.
Yep.
Hello, thanks. Just on the previous point, actually, acquired R&D, it's worth thinking about whether it's in a sense comparable with expensed R&D. At the time it's acquired, it's likely the uncertainty associated with the payoffs is very different from when R&D expenditure first occurs. Certainly under US GAAP, where everything is expensed, I guess under IFRS, then there may be some argument for saying, well, capitalized development expenditure is more certain to lead to the benefits, and that's the whole point of the differential treatment between R&D under IFRS, I think.
Yes, that might actually be a good argument for the differential risk associated with these two R&D activities, acquired versus internally developed. Thank you very much, Peter. Now, what are the implications of my findings? First, the return predictability might be driven by current R&D expenditures instead of capitalized R&D. So we might get some further insight here how R&D expenditures are actually priced. And if we think about the discussion about capitalizing versus expensing R&D under a US GAAP, so meaning under a regime of expensing R&D expenses are equally informative about future realized returns than capitalized R&D. Now, to outline the structure for the presentation, I will first look at the entire cross-section of firms, meaning those with and without R&D expenditures, to speak to the question whether R&D capitalization adjusted book to price ratio is more informative about future realized returns than the unadjusted book to price ratio and R&D to price as separate variables, and will then speak to the subset of firms that actually have R&D expenditures and speak to whether a capitalized R&D to price ratio is more informative about future realized returns than expensed R&D to price. And finally, speak also to the point how R&D activities might actually be priced by the market.
Martin, one more question. Ayun?
Hi, Martin. I'm still, do you mind go back to the slides when you showed our results? I'm still thinking about like your findings. The first part is that if you actually include both R&D and adjusted ratio, that actually have a better association rather than just one factor when you just have book to market, book to price. So as a placebo test, can you just take the, for example, PP&E, another balance sheet assets incremental to the book to price ratio? The reason I ask this is it seems that if you have more factors in the model and then incorporate the heterogeneity across different assets compositions in the firm, potentially you can have a better association with future returns. It may not be kind of like specific about R&D activities here. And then, yeah, so that's just something I'm curious to see, and then why you find this result conceptually, how does that tell me from this empirical observation?
Thanks, Ayun. Just to be clear, I compare the adjusted book to price ratio in a separate regression with a separate regression of R&D to price and the unadjusted book to price ratio. But I can think about how I could construct a placebo test, putting in several other variables, so as to speak to your point. But I will have to think about that. Thanks very much.
So a follow-up is that I think you are aware of last week when we talked about this risk across R&D projects are actually very different. So one thing I'm just curious about your second results is that they are equally informative. Potentially, there are 50% of the R&D projects in the economy are very risky, very uncertain. They're supposed to be expensed. The other 50% are actually safer with a greater success rate. And that potentially can also explain your results regardless of the measurement, right? It just, you're picking up half of the firms supposed to expense, the other half of the firms supposed to capitalize. It just a little discussion about the heterogeneity in the riskiness across R&D project would be helpful to kind of help us understand the empirical evidence you present here, and how do we think about what will be the ideal accounting treatment for those projects.
Okay, I can do that. Thanks. Quickly onto the R&D capitalization methodology that I use throughout the paper. Throughout the paper, I use a straight line capitalization of 5 years of R&D expenditures. And also when I adjust equity book value, I will account for deferred tax liability adjustment for firms with positive earnings. So there's the straight line capitalization adjustment for the last 5 years, which will be scaled by equity market value for the capitalized R&D to price ratio. And the R&D to price ratio, so the expense portion, would just be this variable scaled by equity market value. And then to construct the adjusted book to price ratio, I would add the capitalization, subtract the deferred tax liability in case of positive earnings, and just add the capitalization to equity book value otherwise. Now the inferences, because this is a rather crude assumption for the useful life, especially throughout time, across time, the inferences are also unchanged when I use the sum of years digits method, or the coefficients, which are industry specific, obtained from Lev and Soulianis 1996, or also the inferences are unchanged when I use the coefficients from the Lee and Hall 2018 paper. As for the sample, that we already had a question about, I used the crisp CompuStat merge data with ordinary common shares that exclude, for example, real estate investment trusts, and focus on shares that are traded on NYSE, Amex, and NASDAQ, and require non-missing book to price, earnings, lagged returns, and current returns, equity market values, and also non-negative equity book value. Now, so as to make the sample comparable, the equity, the adjustment to the equity book value for the to account for the capitalized R&D asset would also flip some firms from negative equity book value firms to positive equity book value firms, but exclude those so as to have a fair comparison between the two variables.
Martin, one more question, please, from Stephen.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, I can't hear you.
A difficult thing to do.
Oh, now I hear you. Thank you.
Pardon?
I couldn't hear you. Could you please repeat your question?
Yes. In you're getting your capitalized R&D, amortization rate, correct? Which is either sum of the years digits and or straight line. It's the same for all firms. This is problematic, of course, as I think you well recognize. I mean, if you've a lot of R&D does not. We get those numbers, and including you refer to one of my papers from sort of averages, okay? But the averages tend to be from companies which have successful R&D. A lot of companies haven't had the R&D. If they were capitalized, they would have been impaired and written off. They wouldn't have lasted that time. So R&D is very firm specific, okay, in terms of it's risk involved. A lot of it ends up, if you capitalize, it ends up in impairments, okay? Which of course is one reason for arguing that it all should be expense in this case, because it's so uncertain. I don't know what to do about this, okay? Lev and Srivastava, they use amortization rates that they estimate from successful firms, okay? Those where the R&D is paid off, but ex ante, the R&D, you know, typically does not pay off. So this is somewhat problematic. I don't have any suggestion about how you deal with this, okay? You are using an arbitrary capitalization, saying under this arbitrary capitalization, I'm getting differences, which is fair enough, okay? Mm-hmm. Along with Ayun's comment, the recognition there's different R&Ds and some are much more risky than others, okay, is an important point to recognize. And presumably the more risky R&D would predict higher returns, okay, if the market's efficient. Anyway, that's just something to throw in. Interestingly enough, I think Paul's paper last week indicated that actually expensed R&D actually is discounted by the market. It is treated as an asset, but is discounted by the market 2% lower, which would say that actually this is more risky and you're going to expect higher returns.
But this is also by the very construction of the setting, in that the R&D projects that have been, or whether risk has been resolved, would have been capitalized in that setting. But it's a great point that I should maybe discuss about this.
Yes, I think so, because Lev and Srivastava, they suggest that you can get the amortization rates and they show you how to do it, okay? That may work for a value versus growth investor they're focusing on as a rough adjustment, as an investment device, but it's not a basis for accounting policy, which we're thinking of here, okay? That you're you use the same rate that you estimate for all successful firms for the unsuccessful ones. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of thinking about the accounting that's going to come from this, okay, the accounting policy.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks. So as already mentioned, the sample spans from 1974 to 2019, resulting in about 200,000 firm years to which monthly returns are matched to. And for the subset of firms that have R&D expenditures, we have about 40% of observations, which results in about 78,000 firm year observations to which monthly returns are matched. Now, to give a sense of how these variables interact with each other, we see that the adjusted book-to-price ratio is highly correlated with the book-to-price ratio. These are Spearman rank correlations here. And what we also see is capitalized R&D to price and expense R&D to price for the entire cross-section of firms is negatively related to the book-to-price ratio, indicating that R&D intensive firms actually have a lower book-to-price ratio than those that don't have R&D activities. This is substantiated, or this can already be seen that as the sign flips here for the subsample of firms that have R&D expenditures. Now, as I've already indicated also before, is that R&D to price and capitalized R&D to price are very highly correlated, so that it makes it very challenging to tease out the incremental information content here. Also, to give you a sense of how R&D intensity, that is R&D to assets, have been developing over time, which has also been documented by prior literature. R&D intensity has been increasing over time. And actually for the entire cross-section of firms, when we construct book-to-price quintiles for each year, the growth in R&D intensity is concentrated in the lowest book-to-price quintile, consistent with these firms having actually lower book-to-price ratio than those firms that do not have R&D activities. And
Martin, one more question, please. Sudipta, go ahead.
If you could just go back to the previous correlation table.
Yeah.
So if I look at the R&D to price that you have circled in column 1, row 6, negative 0.19, I look at the across to row 1, column 6. So the sort of the Spearman one, that's positive, whereas this one is negative. So this is sort of saying that this data is very non-linear, right? Because you're getting opposite signs in the Pearson and Spearman correlations. Now, I don't know what you're doing in the regressions, but if you're running just linear regressions, there may be sort of issues when you're dealing with this amount of non-linearity that you might not be doing.
Yes, thank you very much, and great that you spotted that. So the Pearson correlations are above the diagonal, and the Spearman rank correlation, which might already get rid of some of the skewness, are negative. And I think why this result shows up here is that if you actually look at the distribution of the R&D to price ratio in the entire cross-section of firms, of course, you have many firms that do not have R&D expenditures. And this is something that I will account for later in the regressions as well. But I would very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts, whether how I deal with it would be appropriate. Thank you very much. I show that here over time, the share of R&D firms has been stable over time. So actually, the results over here are not because of changes in the sample composition, but really that firms have had more R&D expenditures over time. Now, for the entire cross-section of firms, those with and without R&D expenditures, I run Fama-MacBeth regressions, monthly Fama-MacBeth regressions, in which I regress the monthly returns on the lagged explanatory variables, which I take the natural logarithm of for all explanatory variables but the return variables. And to account for this skewness, first I take the natural logarithm, and I also place dummies for firms that do not have R&D expenditures, and for firms that do not have capitalized a capitalized R&D asset, so as to differentially account for these firms as compared to when you actually have a capitalized R&D asset and R&D to price. So these are the results for large firms, and the first column confirms the positive association between book to price and future realized returns, that the slope coefficient is positive and statistically significant. But, and this is important, the adjusted book to price ratio features a higher association with future realized returns, in that the slope coefficient is higher and the t-value is higher as well. What is now important is, and this is one of the main results, is that once you plug in book to price and R&D to price as separate variables, the sum of these two coefficients, both are statistically significant, are higher than that of the adjusted book to price ratio, which reflects that R&D active firms and R&D to price feature variation, and that is orthogonal to that of the book to price ratio. To exemplify this point,
Martin, before
yeah.
move on, so two questions. First one from Peter Pope, please.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Martin. Just a quick question to clarify the R11 variable here. This is a short-term reversal type information variable, is it? Or
yes, excuse me, I didn't explain that. This is lag monthly return, and R12.2 is lag annual return skipping 1 month. So
this is the most recent month R11, is it?
Yes, exactly.
I mean, it's clearly doing a lot of work. These are massive R squares for monthly Fama-MacBeth regressions, and I guess it's largely attributable to this reversal effect, which you wouldn't normally see in these kind of regressions. Without that, have you looked how important that is?
I have checked the coefficients compared with studies in the recent finance literature, and they mimic quite well the ones that I report here, as well as the adjusted R squared. Note that these are large firms. I also show the results for small firms, and there the R squared substantially drops.
Well, that's why it's particularly interesting or relevant if it's large firms, because I mean, you just wouldn't expect such return predictability for large firm samples. So, I mean, in a sense that, you know, yes, the performance of this regression is, you're not predicting returns. If R11 is kind of explaining the predictability to a large degree, and the t-stats suggest that, then, you know, you're not predicting returns in an exploitable way, are you? Because the lagged return is likely just picking up bid-ask bounce type effects, although, again, I wouldn't expect them to be high for large firms. That's why I'm a bit uneasy with these results.
Mm-hmm. I will have another look at these coefficients and how the results change when I actually not account for that variable. But as I said, the results seem to be in line with some of the finance papers that have recently been published.
Okay, before you move on, Martin, one more question from Sudipta, and then a question from Stephen.
related to the R-squareds, you sort of compared columns 1 and 2 and said that column 2 performs better because of the coefficient in t-stat. But if you look down at the bottom, the adjusted R-squared is actually lower for column 2 than column 1, which says that the regression is performing worse.
Yes.
So I'd like you to comment on that.
Thank you very much. That was actually the comment that I wanted to now make, is that although the coefficient is higher and the t-statistics is that actually the adjusted R-squared is lower, meaning that some of the variation that the capitalized R&D asset adds to the book to price ratio does not necessarily improve the overall model fit. Therefore, it is even more important to use book to price in combination with R&D to price as separate variables in the regression. That was the point that I wanted to make, and very well spotted. Thank you.
Martin, I think that the literature says that the large firms' book to price really doesn't show up very strongly. Okay, this is Chris Astus and the AQR folks, but there's another papers that actually earnings to price is what really matters for large firms.
Excellent.
So this is something to think about. It may be, you may have the situation where in large firms, actually, if they have the R&D, it changes very much for large firms, okay? So that's a point to press, but generally it's not a good benchmark to actually to look at this.
Yes.
Maybe that the R&D here is going to be more important for large firms. I don't know.
Yes, so 2 points on that. Thank you very much. I also do the analysis on small firms as well, but especially here for large firms, there are 2 important things. As you said, earnings to price is more important, as one of your papers has been shown. And actually the results hold when I also control for earnings to price. There, the book to price ratio is subsumed. But also if you think about the Ball, Gerakos, Lenaima, Nikolaev paper, also when you control for retained earnings to price, here the book to price effect is subsumed, but R&D to price is still significant. But if we actually now look at the small firms, this is where you actually see much larger coefficients, and all the effects are, the effect is actually concentrated here.
Yeah,
right.
Well, it's probably in the larger firms, you're going to see the cancelling error property applying. In that, it doesn't matter if you capitalize and amortize or expense, earnings are exactly the same because they're more in sort of steady state.
Yes, thanks very much. And indeed, the effect is much larger here in the small firms. Maybe I should have put this result first. And what is also important here, that I haven't talked about in the previous slide, is that if I include book to price and capitalized R&D to price in the regression, that R&D to price and capitalized R&D to price feature more or less the same information with regards to future realized returns. And this is something that I will explore later on as well. And to also, I mean, these are average results, and some of the comments already suggested that first, this effect might not be very, very strong in big firms, and this might have also changed over time as the R&D intensity summary statistics suggest. So I also plot the 10-year moving average Fama-MacBeth regression slopes over time. This is here to the left, and I also report the associated t-values. And what becomes apparent is, first, as for the average results, the effect is largely here on the small firm subsample, which we have in the black line, the adjusted book to price ratio, and in the gray line, the unadjusted book to price ratio. And the effect becomes apparent here at around 1991. Spikes at around 2000, and thereafter it decreases. When we compare this now to the coefficients of our regression 4, in which we have our book to price ratio and R&D to price in there, is at first the coefficient of the book to price ratio does not change much. So this more or less mimics the one that only includes the book to price ratio. And which is interesting is that R&D to price is more or less stable over time, except for the year 2000, for which there's a huge spike, which then decreases in 2010 as these are 10-year rolling averages. And this is, of course, also reflected in the associated t-values over time. Now, I also form portfolio sorts in which I show that actually the R&D capitalization pushes high R&D to price ratios from low book to price quintiles to higher book to price quintiles, but I will, given the sake of time, will skip over that. The important message here is if I report that over time, the high R&D to price portfolios is that even if you have a useful life of 8 years across all sample years, is that you cannot get rid of all high R&D to price firms in the low book to price, adjusted book to price quintile. Now, to speak to the second research question, which is capitalized R&D to price more informative about future realized returns than expensed R&D to price? For the subsample of firms that have R&D expenditures, I run Fama-MacBeth regressions as well, of the similar type, in that I always control for book to price, equity market value, lagged monthly return, and lagged annual return, skipping one month. And when I compare the R&D to price ratio to the capitalized R&D asset to price ratio, this features more or less the same variation here, in that they're equally informative about future realized returns. So I do different subsample analysis so as to tease out whether there's any information of capitalized R&D to price or R&D to price over and above one or the other variable. So I first do the subsample analysis for a long and short history of R&D expenditures and capture with this DYU5 a dummy variable for which observations have less than 5 years of R&D expenditures. And then we have an interaction term here for the R&D to price ratio and the capitalized R&D to price ratio respectively. So that the main effect here of R&D to price and capitalized R&D to price will capture the firms which have a long history of R&D expenditures. And here I find that even for the subsample of firms that have a high history or a long history of R&D expenditures, that both of the ratio have equal information in predicting future realized returns. And to now consider a case in which current R&D expenditures or R&D to price have no correlation whatsoever with capitalized R&D to price, I consider the subset of firms that have no current R&D expenditures, but capitalized R&D to price. So in other words, the asset comes from past R&D expenditures. And here, there's a small subset of firms of about 4,600 observations. I actually find that capitalized R&D to price for this subset of firms does not have any incremental information about future realized returns.
Martin, question, Sadikta?
So I'm asking this question on behalf of Scott Richardson and Chris Ramesh, who both sort of sent me chat questions about the R-squares on the slide. Ramesh is especially interested in the R-squared in column 5, and I think Scott is interested in the ask was across the slides. So I think they should ask the questions.
I think, Martin, I think you probably explained it. In column 5 looks like a subsample or something like that.
Yes.
I wasn't actually listening to it. I didn't understand what was in column 5 because when I compare the column 2 to, okay, I think I just didn't understand what the subsample in column 5 was. You know.
Yeah, maybe I should have explained that better or made it more apparent already on the slide in also putting in the number of observations there. Thank you very much for this comment. This is indeed a subsample of only 4,600 firms, and therefore there's of course a different R squared, which should not be compared to the R squared of the other observations, which is capturing the R squared for the model for which we have the 78,000 observations.
Martin, can you explain what that subsample is? I'm just curious what that subsample is. You know.
Yeah, so I wanted to have a setting in which there is no correlation of R&D to price and capitalized R&D to price, given that they're so highly correlated. And therefore, I looked at this subsample of firms. Of course, this is a very extreme subsample. I checked the number of firms that actually report R&D expenditures thereafter, which is about 88%. So it might be that this is a subsample that is very special and cannot be generalized to others. Still, I wanted to examine a sample that is where you don't have any correlation of R&D to price and capitalized R&D to price, so as to tease out incremental information. And as already said, here we don't have any statistically significant association of capitalized R&D to price with future realized returns, which may suggest, at least for this subsample, that it may actually be R&D to price, which might predict future realized returns. What I then also do is to have an arbitrary useful life for constructing the capitalized R&D asset, so as to account for the fact that useful lives might be time varying, which has, for example, been shown by Lee and Hall 2018. So I construct a capitalized R&D asset for 3 years, 5 years, and 8 years, estimate my Fama-MacBeth regressions in the sense of column 2 here within the 5 SIC 2-digit R&D intensive industries that have the most observations. And what I find is that looking at the moving average regression slopes within these industries is that there is hardly any information content of the capitalized R&D asset over and above R&D to price, which holds for 4 of the industry R&D intensive industries, and for the for one between 1993 to 2006, you actually find that the highest useful life has the highest association with future realized returns. So that for instruments and related products, which is SIC code 38, you have for a sub-period actually the reverse pattern. This also holds for the T values, so that except for this one industry, we can conclude that we still find, accounting for time varying useful lives, that capitalized R&D to price is equally informative about future realized returns than R&D to price.
I think there's a question from Scott at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Scott?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Does that work? Okay, I think there's mute on the screen and mute on the phone. Sorry about that. And I was going to ask you, what exactly is your research question? Because your entire analysis is looking at future returns, and there's multiple correlated reasons as to why you might see a characteristic associated with future returns. I mean, Stephen sort of walked through the challenges of capitalizing R&D to get to risk. Like if it's a risk story, is that the angle in a push, or is it a mispricing type story? Because I sort of read this a little bit more like a mispricing paper, which is fine. But then the takeaway would be, for firms that most investors care about, large cap, this stuff doesn't matter. Like adding this stuff back doesn't really change anything. But maybe there's something to do with the riskiness of these types of expenditures that are forced to be expensed that's not being fully appreciated somehow. I don't know. It's your paper though. What angle are you trying to push?
Yes, thanks very much for that. Well, first, with regard to the research question, well, there are these two findings in the literature, right? Where some papers find that R&D to price is related to future realized returns. The others argue on capitalized R&D to price are related to future realized returns, but none of them really compare the two and whether there's incremental information content over one above the other. And this is something that I'm trying to tease out here. As to the risk versus mispricing story, I actually also form firm characteristics around the portfolio formation date and show that actually not only that earnings growth and returns are changing around the portfolio formation date, but R&D growth here at time t, you see the earnings growth from t to t+1. So that actually, if you form portfolios on R&D to price, that R&D to price actually captures changes in R&D growth. So there might be two explanations here. One might be a mispricing story, or a mispricing story in that high R&D to price firms actually try to decrease R&D expenditures because they have a direct bottom line impact, and therefore these firms try to just decrease the R&D expenditures here. The other one is that actually these firms experienced some payoffs with regard to their R&D activities, and therefore lowered their R&D expenditures. Both of that might be going on here, and well, you cannot really speak to that here via earnings growth, because earnings growth here also includes R&D expenditures. So I also plotted growth of earnings without R&D expenditures. And here we can also see that around the portfolio formation date, actually these earnings ex R&D increase for the highest R&D to price quintile, for which we see the high returns, which may relate to a risk-based explanation rather than a mispricing explanation. One paper that comes to mind is the Berg, Green, and Nike 1999, 2004, which argued that this might be consistent with time-varying firm-specific risk with regard to these R&D activities, which might be based on a real options perspective of this firm's operation. So this is some evidence on that this might be a risk-based explanation. I hope that somehow speaks to your point. Now to actually wrap up, unless there are other questions, our takeaways are that yes, the book to price ratio adjusted for R&D capitalization actually improves the association between book to price and future realized returns. But if you evaluate R&D to price and unadjusted book to price as separate variables, you have a higher ability to predict future realized returns than the R&D capitalization adjusted book to price ratio, given that R&D active firms may serve as a hedge to the returns of the book to price ratio. And as I just showed, that R&D to price features the same association with future realized returns than capitalized R&D to price for the subsample of firms that have R&D expenditures, and that might be consistent with a risk-based explanation in that R&D to price and capitalized R&D to price capture changes in R&D expenditures, which result in earnings growth ex R&D.
We do have a couple of final questions. So Stephen, go ahead.
Martin, I understand why you're targeting book to price, because it shows up big in the finance literature with Fama and French and so on. They, of course, just bring it in because it's from data dredging, right, without much explanation. And you're trying to sort of bring some accounting to it. But looking back at Sedipto's and Greg's paper in the first in this series, we have a double entry system. And that double entry system says you can't just look at the balance sheet without looking at the income statement, which means that you just can't have book to, it implies that you can't just have book to price in a regression, you've got to have earnings to price also. Because what you do on the balance sheet affects the earnings, the capitalization versus the expensing, for example. So I would suggest you look into that to take a double entry perspective on this, okay? Because that's the system in which these numbers are coming from.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Okay, well then I would like to take the opportunity to thank you very much for your time and your comments. I think they were very, very helpful to me. And yeah, I'm very, very grateful for your time. Thank you very much. And I think also, Alina wanted to make an announcement, or shall I take over?
Oh, yeah, no, so first of all, thank you very much, Martin, for a great presentation. So I know everyone is giving you a virtual applause. So thank you everyone for joining. So we have the next event on the schedule. It is going to be Monday, October 5th. Peter Easton will be presenting attrition bias and inferences regarding earnings properties, evidence from CompuStat data. So as before, you know the drill, you can register, and we'll see you there. So I don't know, Ayung, any parting words?
No, I think Christine Bartison just texting the chat box that last week there's a FASB meetings with doctoral students and scholars, and then they also have archive recordings. So anyone want to kind of take a look at the R&D related topics can go to their website as well. So that will be all. Thank you all for coming today. And thank you, Martin and Lena.
Thank you very much.